The courtroom was packed that morning, tension hanging in the air like smoke, and the judge's gavel had barely touched the wood before the first chuckle escaped his lips. Elon Musk sat across from him, his face an unreadable mask, the only sign of emotion a subtle tapping of his fingers against the table. Judge Hawthorne, a man known for his razor-sharp intellect and even sharper tongue, couldn't help himself. "You really think your little rockets and electric cars can save you here, Mr. Musk?" he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. He leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the power he had in this moment. "Tell me, what's your plan this time? To tweet your way out of it?" A ripple of laughter echoed around the courtroom, a few of the onlookers glancing at each other, as if this was all some kind of joke. Musk, however, didn't react. He didn't even blink. Instead, he met the judge's gaze with the same calm, unwavering look that had made him famous in boardrooms and press conferences. "You know, Judge," Musk said, his voice low and steady, "it's always interesting how people assume the game is over before it's even begun." There was a pause in the room, and a few heads turned in confusion, unsure of what Musk meant. "You see, while you're sitting there laughing at me," Musk continued, his words slow and deliberate, "I'm already several moves ahead of you. And in case you haven't noticed, I've got a bit of a habit of defying expectations." The room fell silent, the laughter dying as quickly as it had started, replaced by a low murmur of disbelief. Musk didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened in his seat, the subtle power of his calmness radiating across the room. Judge Hawthorne, still smirking, leaned forward, clearly ready to take him down. "So you think you can just charm your way out of this, huh? You think your billionaire status and your fancy tricks can win you favor with the court?" Musk looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly, almost imperceptibly, and then he spoke again, this time with an edge that made the judge stop cold. "Judge, you've got one thing right," Musk said, his voice suddenly sharper, more intense. "I don't need to charm anyone. I don't need to play by the same rules you do. I just need to show you something you can't ignore." There was a beat of silence, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Even Judge Hawthorne, who had seen it all, felt something stir inside him, something that told him maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be as simple as he'd thought. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest as he tried to analyze Musk's words. There was something about him, something he couldn't quite place, that made Hawthorne uneasy. For all the bravado Musk exuded in public, there was something different about him in that courtroom, something colder, more calculated. The judge prided himself on reading people, on dissecting every little twitch, every tiny shift in body language. But Musk was proving to be a challenge. He couldn't figure him out. "I'll give you one thing, Mr. Musk," Judge Hawthorne said after a moment, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "You certainly have a lot of confidence. But we both know that won't help you in here. This is the law, not some playground for rich tech billionaires to run around in." He stood up from his chair, walking slowly to the bench as he continued. "You've made a habit of getting what you want by bending the rules, but I assure you, this court isn't going to let you do that." Musk didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the judge as he stood there, his expression still frozen in that unsettling calm. His fingers had stopped tapping, but he wasn't shifting in his seat, wasn't adjusting his posture as most people would when confronted by someone in a position of power. Instead, he simply stared straight ahead, as if the words that were coming out of the judge's mouth didn't matter to him. It wasn't arrogance, not exactly. It was more like he was listening to something else entirely. The tension in the room built, thickening like a storm cloud on the verge of breaking. Everyone was waiting for something to happen. The media representatives were scribbling furiously in their notebooks, some of them glancing up at Musk, some of them eyeing the judge, unsure of who would come out on top. The other attorneys in the room exchanged looks, whispering under their breath, trying to gauge where this was going. No one dared to speak too loudly, though, not with the judge's presence looming over them. The judge sat back down behind the bench, clearly satisfied with his little show of authority. "So, Mr. Musk, are you ready to face the consequences of your actions?" he asked, his voice a mix of amusement and disdain. "Because let me tell you, no one's going to save you this time." Musk finally shifted in his seat, his expression not changing, but there was something in his eyes now, something sharper. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, unassuming document. The judge's eyes narrowed in suspicion as Musk slid it across the table toward him without saying a word. The document was thin, almost paper-thin, and the judge took it, glancing down at it with a quick flick of his eyes. He didn't speak immediately, his brow furrowing as he scanned the paper. "What's this?" Judge Hawthorne asked, his tone no longer as confident as it had been moments ago. He looked up from the paper, his eyes briefly meeting Musk's before glancing down again. "Some sort of joke?" Musk didn't smile, didn't even seem to register the judge's question. He just stared at him, waiting. "It's a subpoena," Musk said simply. "For you." A wave of shock rippled through the room, though it was quickly hidden behind a veil of professional courtesy. The judge's lips twitched, but there was no humor in it now. His eyes darted from the paper back to Musk, disbelief flashing across his face. You're subpoenaing me?" he asked, his voice incredulous. "Do you have any idea who I am? How dare you?" "You're not above the law, Judge," Musk interrupted, his voice even, his words sharp as they sliced through the air. "You might think you can sit up there and pass judgment on others, but the truth is, no one is untouchable. Not even you." The judge's face flushed red, his knuckles tightening around the subpoena in his hand. "You're making a huge mistake, Musk," he hissed, his jaw clenching. "You really think you can pull this off? I've been doing this for longer than you've been playing around with electric cars. You don't know how this works." "Actually, I do," Musk said, his voice unyielding. "I've spent years studying the law, how it works, who makes it work, and who bends it. And I know exactly what I'm doing." The judge leaned forward, his expression now a mixture of disbelief and simmering anger. "You think you can scare me with a piece of paper?" he growled. "I've seen it all. You think I'm going to cower at your little tricks? I'm not the one who's afraid here, Mr. Musk." "Then why are you shaking?" Musk asked coolly, his eyes narrowing slightly, a hint of something almost like a challenge in his voice. "You've been shaking for the last 5 minutes. What's going on, Judge? Are you worried?" The judge froze, his face going pale. For a moment, the room was still, the air thick with the tension of the moment. He couldn't hide it anymore. His hands were trembling, not out of fear for his job, but for something deeper, something more personal, a vulnerability that had suddenly been exposed. And as he looked around the courtroom, he realized that the whole room had noticed. The faces of the lawyers, the media, and the onlookers all held that same look, recognition, mixed with awe. They had seen something in him that they hadn't expected. Musk didn't back down. "You don't get to hide behind your title, Judge. This isn't just a case about you and me. This is about all the people who thought you were untouchable, all the people who have been silenced by your power. I'm not scared of you." He paused, his words deliberate. "But you should be scared of me." The room was completely silent now, save for the faint rustle of papers and the hum of a few nervous breaths. No one moved. The judge's face went from red to a shade of white that looked like it could crack under the weight of his own pride. He didn't know what to say anymore. Every instinct he had told him to fight back, to call the shots, to remind Musk who was in control. But this wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a war of wills. And in that moment, the judge realized something profound. He had underestimated the man sitting across from him, and he wasn't sure if he could get back up from that. For a moment, the entire courtroom was paralyzed by the weight of the silence. The judge's knuckles were white around the subpoena, his breath shallow as though he was suddenly unsure of what to do next. He had been in countless high-stakes cases, cases that had shaped the very legal landscape. But this was different. The game had changed. Musk had done something no one had ever done before, something that had left the judge scrambling for a response. As the seconds stretched on, the eyes of the room shifted from Musk to the judge, and back to Musk again, waiting. The judge's voice, when it finally came, was low and shaky. "You think you can pull this off, do you?" he muttered, his words more to himself than to Musk, as though he was trying to convince himself of something. But Musk didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, watching the judge closely. His eyes never wavered, but there was something different now, something almost comforting about him. He didn't need to say anything more. He had already said it all, in that one moment when he'd handed the judge the subpoena and told him, without hesitation, that no one was above the law. "What do you want, Musk?" The judge's voice cracked with frustration as he finally looked up at the billionaire, his eyes narrowed, searching for some sign of weakness, some crack in the facade that would give him leverage. Musk didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. You want me to be afraid of you? The judge continued, a nervous laugh slipping past his lips. Is that it? You want to make a fool of me in front of everyone here? I don't want anything from you. Musk replied, his voice calm but firm. But you, Judge, you might want something from me. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the room. The judge's lip twitched, but he said nothing. The truth is, I've been watching you, Musk went on, leaning back in his seat as if he had all the time in the world. Watching how you've made decisions, how you've dismissed cases, how you've bent the law to suit your own interests. It's not just about me, Judge. It's about all the others who have had to deal with your bias, your corruption. I'm here to expose that. The room grew still again, the atmosphere so thick it felt like no one could breathe. There was a shift, an undeniable change in the energy that no one could deny. The judge, for the first time, was beginning to look uncomfortable. He had been in power for so long, his decisions untouchable, his word final. He had ruled with the certainty of someone who believed no one could challenge him, who thought the law was just another tool he could manipulate. But here was Musk, this outsider, this entrepreneur with no respect for the old ways, exposing the cracks in the system that had once seemed unbreakable. The judge clenched his jaw, refusing to let the other man see the doubt that was beginning to creep in. He had to hold on. He couldn't let Musk win. He wouldn't let him. You don't get to dictate the rules here, Musk, he said, though his voice now lacked the force it had held before. This is my courtroom. You're not the one who gets to make the decisions. You're here because you broke the law, not because you think you can change it. Is that what you think this is about? Musk asked, raising an eyebrow. You really think this is about one case, one violation? You think I care about that? He shook his head slowly, as if the very idea amused him. No, Judge, this is about something bigger. This is about how the system protects people like you and punishes people like the ones you've ignored for years. You've built your career on that protection. You've used the system to line your pockets, to silence the voices that matter. But not anymore. The judge's face went pale as the truth of Musk's words began to sink in. There was no denying it. The reputation he had built, the power he had wielded so effortlessly, was all based on a system that was rotten at its core. Musk had been the one to expose it, not with a grand speech, not with dramatic gestures, but with a single piece of paper. A subpoena. And in that moment, the judge realized he was no longer in control. He had been caught off guard by a man who wasn't playing by the same rules, a man who was willing to take risks the judge would never have dared. I've spent my whole life making the law work for me, the judge said quietly, almost to himself. But I never stopped to think about who it wasn't working for. Musk didn't respond at first, letting the words hang in the air like a heavy fog. He could have said something, could have rubbed salt in the wound, but he didn't. He wasn't interested in further humiliating the judge. What mattered was that the truth had come to light, and the judge knew it. He could see it in the man's eyes now, in the way his shoulders sagged, in the way he no longer had an answer to Musk's accusations. Musk had done what no one else had been able to do. He had exposed the very thing the judge had spent his entire career protecting. I'm not here to destroy you, Judge, Musk said finally, his voice steady. I'm here to make sure you never have the chance to hurt anyone else again. I'm here to make sure you can't keep hiding behind your title, your status, your so-called power. He leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto the judge's. You don't get to decide who gets to suffer anymore. And you don't get to decide who gets to win. Not this time. The judge opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He looked down at the subpoena once more, his hand shaking as he held it. He had nothing left to say. He couldn't fight this. Not now. Not after everything Musk had just revealed. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by something else, fear. For the first time in his career, the judge realized he was the one who was vulnerable. And it wasn't just his career that was on the line anymore. It was his entire life, the very foundation of his existence. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was crumbling. And he knew it. The silence that had engulfed the courtroom seemed almost unbearable now. The judge, once so confident in his power, sat frozen behind the bench, staring at the subpoena like it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. His hands trembled as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Elon Musk, the man he had so easily underestimated, had flipped the entire script, and now there was no turning back. Musk wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for something much bigger, something that had eluded the judge for years: accountability. As the tension continued to hang thick in the room, Musk sat there, unwavering, not once breaking eye contact with the judge. He had said what needed to be said. He didn't have to say anything more. The room could feel the weight of that quiet confidence. Musk wasn't here to beg for mercy. He wasn't here to charm or manipulate. He was here to make the truth undeniable. And in that moment, the judge knew there was no escape. "What do you want from me, Musk?" the judge finally asked, his voice a mere whisper now. The question was almost lost in the stillness of the room, but it hung there, hanging like a final plea for redemption. The words, though quiet, still carried the weight of someone who had lost all his authority, who was now just a man on the edge of being exposed. Musk leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but unyielding. "I don't need anything from you, Judge," he said, his gaze unwavering. "What I need is for you to understand something. You've spent your entire life working to protect people like yourself, people who sit at the top of the system, untouchable. But the thing is, Judge, people like me, people who have seen the way things work, we've had enough. And we're not going to sit back and let you keep getting away with it." The words hung in the air like an unspoken truth. There were no cheers or applause, no dramatic gestures, just the cold realization that what Musk was saying was right. The judge, for all his years of experience, had never faced anyone like Musk before. And now that the weight of those words had settled in, he couldn't ignore it. His entire career, the very foundation of his power, was based on the belief that the system he upheld was fair, impartial. But Musk had torn that illusion apart with nothing more than a few sharp words and an unrelenting gaze. "I've made mistakes," the judge said quietly, finally breaking the silence that had stretched on too long. His voice was still shaky, but it carried a weight that none of his earlier arrogance had. "I've made plenty of mistakes." Musk's eyes softened for just a second, and he leaned back in his seat. He wasn't here to destroy the man sitting in front of him. He was here to expose the truth. "We all make mistakes, Judge," Musk replied. "But it's what we do after we make them that matters. You can't keep blaming the system, blaming the people around you. You made a choice, and now you have to live with it." There was a pause, and the room felt like it was holding its breath. The judge didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked down at the subpoena again, his fingers still trembling. For a moment, it looked as though he might crumble. He had built his life on the belief that he could control everything, that he could bend the law to his will, that he could sit behind that bench with impunity. But now, here he was, stripped of everything, facing a man who was showing him that no one, not even him, was untouchable. Finally, the judge stood up, his legs shaking as he did. For the first time, the room seemed to hold its breath. His voice was barely audible as he spoke, but everyone in the room could hear the tremor in it. I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his eyes meeting Musk's, his face pale. "I don't know if I can fix this." Musk didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of sympathy. He had no interest in offering forgiveness, no interest in playing a game of redemption. "You don't need to fix anything, Judge," Musk said firmly. "You just need to stop pretending that you're above it all. You need to stop hiding behind your position of power, pretending that the law doesn't apply to you. That's the only way this system will ever change." The judge's eyes filled with something Musk couldn't quite read. Was it shame, regret, or something deeper, something more personal that had finally been exposed? It didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time, the man who had spent his entire life sitting in judgment of others was now the one who was being judged. And he knew, deep down, that Musk was right. The system needed to change. It had needed to change for a long time. "I've spent my whole life protecting a lie," the judge said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've kept it hidden, convincing myself it was all for the greater good. But maybe I've been wrong all along." Musk nodded slowly, acknowledging the judge's words without offering any further comment. He didn't need to say anything else. The change had already begun. The realization was there, sitting heavy in the air between them. The courtroom, which had once been filled with the sound of murmurs and laughter, was now eerily quiet. Even the lawyers and the media had stopped scribbling, unable to look away from the exchange that was unfolding before them. The judge turned slowly, his eyes never leaving Musk's as he made his way back to his seat. There was no arrogance left in him now, no smirking, just a quiet resignation that this was the moment he had been forced to confront. The system he had built his career on was no longer the same. It was crumbling around him, and he didn't know if there was a way to fix it. All he knew now was that he had been given a chance to change, to make things right. Whether he would take it, only time would tell. Musk didn't wait for the judge to speak again. He stood up, his movements measured, and walked out of the courtroom. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The truth had been laid bare. The system was broken, and now, it was up to those who saw the truth to fix it. As Musk left the courtroom, the atmosphere felt heavy, thick with the kind of quiet that only comes after a storm. The hallway outside was filled with people, reporters, lawyers, and onlookers who had all been waiting for the drama inside to spill over into the real world. But Musk didn't look at any of them. He walked with purpose, his mind already moving past the scene he'd just left behind. He had done what needed to be done, exposed the corruption that had been hidden in plain sight for too long. But that wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Outside, the bright sunlight hit his face, but he didn't squint, didn't flinch. It was as if he'd become numb to everything, as if the world had shifted into a new reality, one that he had known was coming but had never fully prepared for. His steps were steady, but there was a weight to them now, a weight that had not been there before. This wasn't about the legal battle anymore. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something much bigger. It was about shaking the very foundation of a system that had kept so many people in check for so long. Musk didn't look back at the courthouse. He didn't need to. He had made his point. The truth had been laid bare, and the world would have to reckon with it. But not everyone was ready to accept it. Back inside the courthouse, the mood was different. The judge had retreated to his chambers, his face pale, his shoulders slumped in a way that seemed foreign to him. He was still processing what had just happened, trying to make sense of the whirlwind that had turned his life upside down in a matter of hours. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, exposed. He had never been the one on the receiving end of scrutiny. It had always been others who had stood in the defendant's seat, always been others who had been forced to face his judgments. Now it was him. And for the first time, he realized how easy it was to become a target when you had spent your life throwing stones. The judge's door opened, and one of his assistants stepped inside, her expression cautious but knowing. "Sir," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The media is already asking questions. They're going to want a statement." He didn't respond immediately. He simply stared out the window, his mind still reeling. It felt like the world had tilted on its axis. "Tell them I'm not ready yet," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say." The assistant nodded, but she didn't leave immediately. She stood there for a moment, as though deciding whether or not to speak. "Sir, what happened in that courtroom? You don't have to go through this alone. You know that, right?" The judge turned slowly, his gaze settling on her, but there was no anger in his eyes, only a kind of weariness. "I've spent my life alone," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I built this life with my own hands. And now, I'm not sure I can fix what's broken." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I thought I could protect myself. I thought I could stay ahead of it all. But I was wrong." The assistant didn't say anything, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she knew the weight of the words that had just been spoken. There was nothing to say in response to that kind of admission. She simply nodded and left the room, leaving the judge alone with his thoughts. Meanwhile, the media outside was buzzing. The reporters gathered in clusters, each one hoping to get a statement, hoping to be the one who would break the next big story. They had all seen the tension inside the courtroom, had felt the seismic shift as Musk exposed the truth about the judge. But no one had expected it to go this far. They had assumed it would be business as usual, the same legal theatrics that played out in every courtroom. But Musk had thrown a wrench into the machine. And now, no one knew where the pieces would land. One of the reporters, a young woman with a sharp eye and a quick pen, approached a colleague. "What do you think's going to happen now?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. "Is the judge going to resign? Will they even let him continue? What's the next move?" Her colleague, an older man who had seen more courtroom dramas than he cared to count, shrugged. "I don't know. But this isn't going to be over anytime soon. Musk just started something. This won't be swept under the rug like everything else." The young reporter nodded, her eyes darting over to the courthouse doors, wondering when the next revelation would come. She knew one thing for sure. This story wasn't finished. In fact, it had only just begun. Back in his office, Musk sat at his desk, his hands folded in front of him. The phone had been ringing off the hook ever since he'd left the courthouse, but he hadn't answered it. There was no need. He had already made his move. He didn't need the media to tell his story. They would catch up. They always did. What mattered now was the bigger picture. He wasn't just fighting for justice in one case. He was fighting to change the entire system, to show the world that it was possible to hold the powerful accountable. His phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a call. It was a message, a simple text from an anonymous number. "You've made a powerful enemy today." Musk didn't flinch as he read the message. It was a warning, sure, but it was also a sign of something else. The people who had been complicit in the system he was trying to dismantle were watching. They were paying attention, and they weren't happy. But that was fine. They could threaten him all they wanted. They could try to stop him, but the truth was already out there. The cat was out of the bag, and there was no putting it back. Musk set the phone down and stood up, staring out the window at the city below. This was the beginning of something bigger, something that couldn't be undone. The fight was just starting, and he was ready for whatever came next.